Hello, colleagues and friends. I'm Rosabeth Moss Kanter, and I am incredibly honored to receive this award. Very grateful to you for your support, and of course, grateful for our profession of sociology for providing me and all of us with the opportunity to study and weigh in on the most important issues of our changing time. Sociology really started when the world was changing from agrarian to industrial societies and creating new kinds of institutions. And now we're again in a period of enormous upheaval and change. I'm going to talk to you briefly and unscripted and spontaneously about some of the things that have been very important in helping shed light on these new phenomenon. I've always been interested in the nature of systems. That's the core of sociology, how variables interact to produce social conditions, how they create structures and institutions, and how that interacts with human behavior, either shapes human behavior, constrains human behavior, or how institutions are changed by human agency. I wrote about the nature of commitment early on, and commitment, which is beliefs on the part of people, decisions on the part of people to stay connected to social institutions, in that case, utopian communities, was a matter of the kind of organizational mechanisms that they put in place. It wasn't only springing from the desire of people to believe, it was the fact that the social context gave people something to believe in and a reason to remain connected. So that got me interested in strong versus weak institutions, in who succeeds and who fails, the nature of advantage or disadvantage, and how it is that organizations shape prospects for people's careers, and why work is so central in people's lives. When I wrote Men and Women of the Corporation, when I did the series of studies that led to writing a book, Men and Women of the Corporation, I did it out of annoyance. I was annoyed at the stereotypes that were floating around at that time about why women were not succeeding in the same numbers as men in corporations, in the business world, and in fact, in many worlds of achievement. I knew women had the talent, and it was irritating to me to hear the stereotypical reasons that all blamed the victim, that said it had to do with women fearing success, or women being bossy bosses, or women not supporting other women. And I didn't feel in my observations or my reactions to my own work and aspirations that was the case. And so I looked at the nature of organizations that were causing those phenomena, and in the course of doing it, I got to illuminate, do a field study of what life was like in a big American industrial corporation just before we began to change from that bureaucratic hierarchical model to new models. But I could see in the nature of hierarchy, not in the nature of women, why some people did better than others. It had to do with cycles of advantage and cycles of disadvantage, opportunity, power, and numbers, and also, of course, the nature of managerial work, that managerial work, particularly the work that brought great amounts of power and affluence, was work that had high risk associated with it, and when people had to place bets on who to trust, they tended to bet on those who looked like them, who came from similar social circumstances. So that was the first big finding of that book about advantage, about why we favor people like us in risky situations, but are willing to take a risk in routine situations, and that women and other people who are disadvantaged were, by and large, in the routine jobs, and those jobs were less likely to have opportunity and power. And opportunity accounted for aspirations, hard to aspire if the door is closed. Power accounted for how people did as bosses. There's a big preference for people with power. They can do favors. And then I talked about numbers, how having just one of a particular kind of person was not enough to break the cycle of disadvantage and turn it into a cycle of advantage. I returned to that theme in my work on confidence. Confidence sounds like it's intrapsychic, but again, I was looking at social and structural and institutional factors. That book, in some ways, is an outgrowth. That series of research projects that became a book is an outgrowth of the same kind of reasoning in Men and Women of the Corporation about how structure shapes behavior. It leads to behavior that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and puts people in certain positions. So for confidence, I looked at the nature of cycles of success, cycles of failure, but I added something that's been a thread in my work ever since, and that is agency, leadership. Who shifts a cycle? How does that happen? So cycles of decline or cycles of failure have particular behavioral characteristics that create a self-fulfilling prophecy. It means that people pull back, they don't communicate, they make decisions in secret. There's infighting and passivity, low innovation. Innovation was a theme that I had looked at in my studies for the Change Masters. Cycles of advantage are just the opposite, more open communication, collaboration, teamwork, initiative. But to shift the cycle required leaders. Why a winning streak would ever end, why a cycle of advantage would ever end, well, there we have to invoke exogenous factors, technology, complacency, competition, change, and that was one of the ways in which I began to look at the wider context shaping organizations and shaping work. But it was leaders that made the difference in shaping the culture that then shaped behavior, that then made winning or success possible. And one of the things that was exciting to me about that project was that I studied not only organizations of the classic kind, big companies, community organizations, a country, South Africa, turned around by Nelson Mandela, but I also studied sports teams, and I actually studied them, not just used the metaphors, because here in sports we could see repeated episodes of behavior with clear measures of success or failure. What was exciting to me in that project, which confirmed these dynamics of decline or success across system levels, but what was exciting is when we looked for the sports teams in recent history with the longest winning streaks or the longest losing streaks in professional or college sports, primarily in North America, but also looked at international test cricket and a few other international sports. But in the U.S., two of the teams with the longest winning streaks were women's teams. University of Connecticut women's basketball and University of North Carolina women's soccer. And it was exciting to me because that also confirmed one of the hypotheses in Men and Women of the Corporation, that our differences are not that great, but the social categories were put in and the positions were put in is what makes differences emerge. There were those teams doing beautifully. And how did they start their winning streaks? How did they get started? It was because of Title IX, a change in the context that meant that schools had to fund women's sports, and great coaches came along and got winning performance out of talented women. I also looked at decline in the form of one team in Texas that had the longest losing streak in college football history, and that was in part caused by the civil rights movement and the ability for historical black colleges to no longer, lack of ability to still attract the best students. No longer could they have the best students because those best students were scooped up by other places. And that helped start the decline in the sports in one of those colleges. Not all of them, but it wasn't that interesting. So we saw the interplay of policy of larger societal forces with social structures, with behavior making a difference in outcomes. And I continue to pursue some of those themes. I continue to look at how various cultures with new technology and evolve. I looked at digital culture and why some organizations were able to change, others were not. In Supercorp, I looked at companies that were able to innovate by doing social good. And what was it about their patterns, including their diversity in the workplace, their desire to have values? How did that attract and hold the best employees? That's a theme that I continue to pursue today. And I continue to look at communities as the context in which all of this occurs. In World Class, the early days of widespread modern globalization at the dawn of the Internet era, I looked at globalization in terms of classic sociological concepts, cosmopolitans versus locals, cosmopolitans that were part of global business networks but were no longer wedded to local communities, how the locals left behind responded to that, and then what cities could do to win business in the global economy, to hold companies and to create a rich environment in which all their people could flourish. And I had 3 models: Boston, the brains of Boston, a capital of innovation; Spartanburg, Greenville, South Carolina, a manufacturing center for the world; working class skills because of community colleges and job training; and Miami, a capital of trade that flourished because it connected North America with Latin America and became, for a while, the operative capital of Latin America. Today, recently, I should say, not today, but in my book Move, about transportation in America, which sounds like nothing like any of the other themes, but in Men and Women of the Corporation, I talked about people as either moving or stuck, depending on the opportunity they had. And Move is all about mobility as opportunity. And that means not only social mobility, but physical mobility, because physical mobility creates social mobility. It accounts for the ability of people to transcend a community that they're born into and have opportunity outside that community or grow within the community because they have access to jobs and health care and education. So I think that my whole career has been about organizations, occupations, and work, of course, but it's been about what creates a better world, more opportunity for all people to flourish and not be confined in social categories. I hope in this age of new disruptive technology, which I'm studying right now, I hope in that new age of disruptive technology, opportunities will continue to grow for people. We will reinvent workplaces. We will harness the gig economy and have new kinds of networked organizations, collaborations, and coalitions that will provide new opportunities for humanity, even in the face of artificial intelligence. I think our own intelligence will carry us through, and the sociological imagination. So thank you again for honoring me in this way.